sudden they see headlights coming at them down the highway, but in a wrong direction. So the patient tells them that they were trying to turn their car to the right abruptly and they tried to slam on the brakes, but the other car still smashed into the driver's side. All the airbags deployed. The patient had their seatbelt on, but the windshield was completely shattered. There was smoke coming out of the engine. The patient looks down at their hands and they're bleeding. Multiple fingers have tears on the skin. The person tried to unbuckle their seatbelt and get out of the car, but they couldn't. So now they start to panic. And it takes minutes or even a little bit longer for the police and the fire truck to show up. They try to remove the patient, but they have to cut through the roof. They strap the patient into a stretcher. They put a cervical collar around their neck. They drive the patient to the nearest hospital. The patient is looking for their phone, trying to locate a phone number, and they can't find it. The patient goes through CAT scans. They get stitches. They get x-rays. The patient finds out they broke their wrist. And finally, after 5 hours, the patient's wife shows up at the ER. And then the patient just breaks down. So it's a very emotional retelling. And it's always challenging because, again, these people don't want to relive that experience. They've tried to avoid it for all that time, but the therapist is trying to talk them through it. So during this conversation, as the patient is talking about the car and the music and the seatbelt and the broken windshield and the bleeding, the therapist is going to be holding up their fingers and the patient will be focused on the fingers while the therapist is moving their hand back and forth. And that's EMDR. Now, during that process, the goal is that the therapist will step in periodically with reassuring words. For example, they can advise the patient, even though you broke your wrist, you wore a splint, you had a cast, and it healed completely. You have no pain whatsoever. In fact, you play basketball. So that allows the patient to desensitize part of that negative event. Now, the goal is over time, all of those negative thoughts, one by one, will be broken down. And so the patient can realize that the car accident was a one-and-done situation. There's not a car accident every single day. The emotions over time will reduce, and eventually that patient will hopefully be able to drive again on highways freely without feeling overwhelmed. Now, EMDR does require multiple sessions. It's an 8-step process, and most people need between 8 to 20 visits to really get the benefit of all the therapy. Remember, these are traumatic events, so even though it happened a long time ago, it takes months or years for that patient to recover. So one session is not going to be enough to cure PTSD. Now, Al also asked a question about early initiation of EMDR to prevent PTSD. And I tried to research that specific question, and I really couldn't get a good answer. As we talked about earlier, PTSD has so many variables, and each person responds in a different way. Some symptoms could be very mild, and they go away within a couple of weeks. Others are completely disabling. The key is intervention, so the earlier you start therapy or medication, the better the outcomes are going to be. But I don't have a specific timetable, like there's not a certain date or a certain week where EMDR has been shown to prevent PTSD, so unfortunately I don't have a good answer for that. I do recommend that anyone who's gone through any type of traumatic event, whether it's a sexual assault, domestic abuse, a car accident, a death in the family, any type of combat, anything where it could be traumatic, that person should seek out mental health services. Now, in the ER, every day I see people who are suffering with issues related to PTSD. They may be in the ER for a sore throat, or maybe they have a back injury from lifting boxes over the weekend. But when I go through their history and I see some of the symptoms they're describing, I realize that they were undiagnosed. They may have had a traumatic event 3 years ago, but they never reached out to anyone, and over time, they've kind of avoided any care for that. So the earlier we offer services, the better those outcomes will be. Now, a little bit more history about EMDR based on my research. It was actually developed by Dr. Francine Shapiro back in 1987. She published her research in 1989 and also published a book in 1995. Now, her findings were so successful that the Department of Defense and the American Psychiatric Association recommend EMDR for most people with PTSD. So I included a reference on our blog so that you can link to it and read more about EMDR therapy. So I hope you learned more about PTSD and all of the other treatment options today. You can visit www.thedepressionfiles.com to get more insight and listen to the interviews with Al. You can also visit my website, simplehealthradio.com, to read the blog for this episode and share it with your family and friends. I've also included references to PTSD. You can even record your own question and send it to me for next week's episode. Be sure to connect with us on Twitter And I thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Visit simplehealthradio.com to read the blog, follow links mentioned on this episode, and easily share content with your family and friends. Subscribe to the show on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, and the 3 and Out Radio Network. Be sure to connect with Dr. Emron on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and Tumblr to send us your questions and ideas.